process large pieces of material. Once you develop jaws and once you develop teeth, you now have the ability to manipulate food and objects in your environment. You now have the ability to grasp prey, prevent it from escaping. You now have the ability to reduce the particle size. So if you have a large item of food, you can make that into a small item of food and process that internally. Having jaws then opens up a lot of new niches that jawless vertebrates do not have open to them. So we want to look at a few things about jaws. Well, where did jaws come from? In other words, you have two options in evolutionary history. Is something just created de novo? And in other words, it's a new mutation, a new structure that had no comparable homologous structure in the ancestor? Or is it a modification of something that was in the ancestors of that particular group? So is it a new structure or is it a modification of an old structure? What were jaws? Anybody know? Close.
They were
Okay, they're going to be derived from the gill arches. And probably a better term, well, no, we can use gill arch. Okay. We go into a lot more detail in comparative anatomy, but...
Would the gill arches also be referred to as the pharyngeal arches?
Yes, a pharyngeal arch is a broader term. And so again, if you take comparative, that refers to these structural supports that are in the pharyngeal throat area of vertebrates. If those pharyngeal arches are modified in order to support gill tissue, then it is a gill arch. So a gill arch is a specific kind of pharyngeal arch. So, what have I got on the board here? Well, I'm illustrating the gill pouches, if you will, or pharyngeal pouches of a fish. And so you do have these pouches in the anterior part of the animal, in the pharyngeal area. My little lines coming out would just indicate gill tissue, so where gas exchange is going to take place. This soft tissue is supported by skeletal material. That skeletal material, each of those is a pharyngeal arch or gill arch. Now, I drew them as simple bars, but that's not really the way it was in the ancestors of gnathostomes. 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, I drew them as simple bars. In reality, they were segmented structures. They consisted of different components. Each of these is called a word that ends in branchial. So it could be the basibranchial, the hypobranchial, ceratobranchial, epibranchial, pharyngobranchial. I don't want you to know all those names. Take comparative anatomy and you'll have to. But these are the two important ones, the epibranchial and ceratobranchial. Okay? So you have those structures on each side of the animal. What occurred over evolutionary time? This first pharyngeal arch made up of those different parts, became modified. We lost the pharyngeal, we lost the hypo and the basibranchial. Right? So that leaves us with two, our epibranchial and our ceratobranchial. And you've got one on each side, epi on each side, cerato on each side. So it used to support that gill pouch, but instead we can take those epis and ceratos, go like that in the midline, fuse them together, and now we have jaws. So jaws are derived from these pharyngeal or gill arches, specifically from the epibranchial and ceratobranchial portions that simply fused in the midline. That's how jaws came about. It's a well-established idea based primarily on studies of embryological development. You can see these things developing from the gill arches, from the pharyngeal arches into the jaws. I'm not going to go through jaw suspension. That's good enough. All right. So we have the gnathostomes, and then we have two broad groups of the living gnathostomes, the extinct placoderms and the acanthodians. The chondrichthyes and the osteichthyes. Chondrichthyes is still used as a class. Osteichthyes usually is not anymore. It's just a large grouping of fish. Chondrichthyes, what characterizes them is right in the word, chondrichthyes. So the C-H-O-N-D-R means what? Who?
Cartilage.
Cartilage, yes, it means cartilage. And ichthy means fish, so we have our cartilaginous fishes. These are animals whose endoskeleton is made up of cartilage. They don't have any bone inside to support their structures. Instead, it's all cartilage. They don't have bony armor on the outside either. They do have placoid scales, which some of you have looked at in lab. All of you need to at some point. Placoid scales are interesting because they have a shape something like that. They have a base to them and then the spine that is coming up. And they're somewhat similar to a tooth because the basic material of a placoid scale is dentine, similar in composition to bone, but it has more fibers in it. And it is hollow on the inside with living tissue. So you actually have a pulp cavity on the inside of that scale. And that is very similar to the structure of a tooth. You have dentine in your teeth, you have a pulp cavity inside your teeth as well. It is believed that these placoid scales are derived from the bony armor of our ancient ostracoderms and then placoderms and whatever. So the fact that chondrichthyes, sharks and rays, don't have bone in their skeleton is a secondary evolutionary result. In other words, it is not primitive, right? It's not that they were very, very primitive vertebrates that never evolved bone, but they do have vertebrae. No, they evolved from bony ancestors. They lost the bone in the skeleton over evolutionary time, but their ancestors had it. I'm not going to go into those different groups. So again, I'm really going through these fast and not giving a lot of information, just hitting some highlights. The osteichthyes then, these are your bony fishes. And we have different groups. Sarcopterygii. Within them, we have the dipnoi. And the Crossopterygii. The Ripidistions. We'll just mention those right now. So, Sarcopterygii versus Actinopterygii. It's just referring to the structure of the fins. So that in the Sarcopterygii, when you look at those animals, they usually have an internal skeletal support in the fin, as opposed to the Actinopterygii that just have proteinaceous fibers inside, strengthening their fin. Those fibers may be calcified, but it is not a skeletal structure per se in the Actinopterygii. But there is, at the base, bony structures in the Sarcopterygii. In addition, the muscles that move the fin in the Actinopterygii, those muscles are all anchored inside the body. Right? So they're anchored in the body and then they extend out onto that fin. But in the Sarcopterygii, because you do have skeletal elements inside the base of the fin, you can also have other muscles that are being anchored on those skeletal elements out in the fin. So two big differences between those groups. The dipnoi, of course, are what? Yeah, lungfish, that's all we need to say. We do have another large grouping called the Crossopterygii. It is paraphyletic, but it does contain this group of fishes, the Ripidistia. The Ripidistia I bring up for one reason, and that is that these are presumed to be the ancestors of amphibians, so the ancestors of terrestrial vertebrates. Actinopterygii, these are the most successful group on the planet. So Sarcopterygii, they're interesting because of the lungfish and because they're the ancestors of terrestrial vertebrates. The Actinopterygii, however, dominate fishes, right, from ancient times on, from what's called the Carboniferous times on. These are the dominant fish in the marine environment, despite the presence of sharks and rays. We're dominated by Actinopterygii in the oceans. And virtually all fresh, there's only a couple of exceptions, all fresh water, freshwater fishes are Actinopterygii. Yeah, you got a few lamprey and stuff like that, and there are a couple chondrichthyes that come into fresh water. But most are Actinopterygii. Okay, so they dominate the marine environment, and they even dominate more in the freshwater environment. Okay, this is the most diverse group of vertebrates in terms of number of species and in terms of number of body forms. All right, so it's a very successful group. Lots of different species, lots of different body forms. And the success of the Actinopterygii is largely based upon adaptations for locomotion and feeding. Right, so they have some novel developments concerning locomotion and feeding that allow them to be so successful. In other words, to diversify greatly. So let's look at locomotion first, and then a little bit about feeding. Okay. So remember, early on, that our fishes had these big, bulky, bony plates on the outside. And so it's